For this recap review, we're covering 3 episodes, so each episode will be summarized within its own section. But when it comes to the review section, which deals with the highlights, low points, and on the fence, that's all going to be done for all 3 episodes. So to begin, the first episode deals with the Navajo activists who have one of their own infiltrate their protest and end up almost sending them all to jail. To go into some detail, Derek is someone who left the Navajo Nation, and not out of controversy, but because he went off to college on a scholarship, basketball to be specific. He comes back and he reintegrates into the protest. I don't want to say protest culture, but definitely the protests that have long been happening regarding a local uranium facility which has long poisoned their nation. Chase is someone who's very energetic, very unapologetic, and a little bit of a troublemaker. Natani is somebody who is trying to work with the local tribal leaders and really push, them to get involved more. And Shundeen, who is his sister, she's sort of in the middle between Natani and Chase. With Derek there, who is, by the way, Shundeen's ex in a way, he finds himself lighting a fire underneath them all in terms of exploiting a potential weak point in a uranium mine in order to wipe it out. And the reason why this weak point exists is because that it was built in World War II, hasn't been updated, so based off of some family who used to talk about how this one point if someone ever messed with it would destroy the whole facility, that's his focus. And the reason that's his focus is because he got into some trouble back in college, even flunked out. This FBI agent picked him up after he got sent to jail, and pretty much he's been working as a CI or informant for this agent ever since. And of course, as we've seen with the Black Panther Party and also with different other civil rights organizations, it only takes one who you think is kinfolk, but is only skinfolk to ruin everything that's being done. And in the case of Derek, the FBI agent hands him a gun so that it could up the charges from just trespassing in the mine to something that could be a bit more better for the FBI agent's career. And unlucky for Derek and his friends, they have to take a security guard hostage. They're unable to do whatever it is that Derek proposed in order to break the uranium mine. And then when the FBI agent and all his people come, not only does Natani through Shundeen realize that, hey, Derek screwed us over, and then of course Chase realizes too, but when it's time to surrender, the FBI agent decides to plant the gun onto Derek, shoot him, and use that to up the charges. And then to make matters worse, when Natani, Shundeen, and Chase are on trial, the security guard who's taken hostage, who saw everything, he sides with the FBI agent as if that's going to lead to him getting a promotion or some big gig. Not at all. In fact, when the FBI agent was trying to recruit Natani and replace Derek, he said straight up, I didn't have to pay him. I didn't really even have to ask him. He just straight up volunteered. And luckily for Natani and his friends, as well as his sister, of course, the bailiff, who Chase was giving a lot of crap to for working for the white man, she was recording the whole conversation when the FBI agent was telling that he didn't have to get the security guard to lie on the stand, the whole situation with Derek, and even, make it clear that, hey, you helped me out, all this can go away. And thanks to recording it, that meant that when it's come out into the courtroom, all charges are getting dropped. The FBI agent, of course, gets in trouble. But the big thing is, the whole uranium mine situation, it finally gets the attention of something beyond the tribal leaders and gets to the national, federal government, and that leads to a pause, if not a complete stoppage, of the use of this mine as it gets investigated. The next episode deals with a Me Too story. Brenda is an up-and-coming comedian who's just finally gotten her act together, both in terms of personal life and professional, in terms of, her stand-up act. And with that, she's trying to use the connections at the club she works at, called Goldie's, and through Joyce, try to reconnect with Zeke, who's somebody who also came up with her. She even had some relationships back in the day, but now Zeke is really blowing up, and she's hoping through him she can get a hosting gig, maybe open for him, something to like really get her career going. In order to try to get this done, she decides to have Chad, who is her closest friend, take her to a party that Zeke is having, and Zeke remembers her. It's all cool, and she decides, okay, this is my time. Let me show him what I'm doing. They go to a quiet bedroom. They see, and Zeke is like, cool, I like what you're doing. You can host, maybe down the line feature. And it was all good for maybe a few minutes. But then Zeke goes from, trying to be aggressive and take initiative in terms of, having an intimate moment, to just straight out raping Brenda. And to make matters worse, the first person Brenda tells about this is Joyce, who owns Goldie's, and in order to protect her golden goose, which is Zeke, she tries to have Brenda downplay what happened, say, hey, you got a good thing going in terms of this hosting gig, shut up, and recognize this is just what happens in this industry. And Joyce even makes it clear this happened to me, and yada yada yada. That doesn't sit well with Brenda. She decides to go to the cops. She then even decides to, make sure to get a rape kit and everything. And this goes up to ADA Lavinge's desk. And unfortunately, because Brenda's set is very racy, and she has a history of being promiscuous in the eyes of him, he doesn't think he has a case. And what doesn't help is that Chad, when he was interviewed, he didn't lie about Brenda's sexual and relationship history. So with that, she's a bit mad at him, and what doesn't help the situation is that this whole stuff has blown up on social media in terms of Zeke potentially being a rapist. So a lot of people coming at Brenda sideways. She gets a defender in the name of Tess, and Tess is somebody who's a little cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. She befriends Brenda and even tries to isolate her in a way so that Chad is no longer welcome, but Chad is like, whatever, up until the point where Tess was going to call the cops on Chad, and with Chad being a black guy, this white woman calling the cops saying he's trespassing, he knows it's not a good look. So he exits Brenda's life for a while because Tess is doing the most. And to prove that she is someone who's capable and likes to do the most, when Brenda puts onto a social media post of Zeke about how the only way you can understand how I feel is someone put gasoline on you and set fire to you, Tess decides, you know what, I'm going to do just that. And that leads to the case of the episode, which is similar to episode 1's in terms of whether or not Brenda can be considered complicit in this. I think the exact charge is aggravated mayhem. And luckily for her, she doesn't get charged, but she doesn't also get the resolution that she desires either. Zeke still got away with raping her, but at the same time, Zeke's face is now partially burned to the point where he kind of looks like Deadpool. So it's one of them situations where, yay, that he got some type of comic retribution, but at the same time, he did not get the charge that would have stopped him from potentially doing this again. The last episode we're talking about for this recap is the latest episode, which has an InfoWars fake news movement take on it, as a woman named Laura deals with a woman named Joanne who says that, in terms of Laura's son Liam, he did not die in a school shooting. To break it down, Laura is a professor, and she has a husband named Eric. She has a son named Jonah, and formerly she had a son named Liam. Well, he's still a son, but he died in a school shooting. When it comes to the family dynamic, Laura and Eric are bonding and weaving together because they have a support group. When it comes to Jonah, he doesn't have that same support in a way. Eric does check up on him, and they talk about how awkward it is, especially as Jonah puts on a video game and sees his brother's name is there. But as for Laura, she's not necessarily doing what he needs. Laura's focus outside of Eric is very much on being an advocate for gun legislation, and that draws negative attention to them in the form of Joanne. And one of the reasons why Joanne, of all people, setting sights onto Laura's life is not the best is because one of the things that need to be noted is when it comes to Liam and Jonah, Laura and Eric's original intention was just to adopt Liam, but once they found out he had an older brother, that's when Jonah came into the picture. So with that, he's a bonus son, but he's not the one who they intentionally, even in the first place, were focused on. So that kind of gives you some background on why maybe Jonah and Laura don't necessarily have a chummy relationship. And it's not that she doesn't like him or anything, it's just, if you look into the extra details, there might be some reasons that aren't necessarily dived into when it comes to this episode. That relationship aside, because Laura's trying to become an advocate for gun legislation, and she's now dealing with people like Laura saying that the shooting never happened, her son is fake and all that, and adding in that she's a college professor, her thought is, maybe if I educate these people, that'll help them understand that this isn't a lie, this isn't fake, and that could possibly solve the issue. At first, this is very much true, as we see her, with another set of parents, try to host a Q&A, and they seemingly are kind of getting somewhere, but then Joanne shows up, mentions that the last name of Laura matches the last name of an anti-gun person in Europe, and with that, it devolves from being a conversation, allowing for information being exchanged, to just being what feels like a personal attack. And it goes from that small altercation to becoming so much bigger as Joanne's people, in Laura's mind, they dox her, they attack Jonah, and it just becomes a case where she questions if her and her family can even stay in the area anymore. And while for Eric, he has a job, he could work remotely, Jonah could go to a new school, but Laura's situation is much more complicated because she's a professor. She was on a tenure track, but now she's dealing with all this harassment, which includes a potential harassment case that's being investigated. And add on, when she tries to confront Joanne again, she gets hit with a restraining order, so now she's not sure what to do. Her people are coming after her family. She doesn't want to move because, it takes a lot to get it on a tenure track. And adding that Eric buys a gun, it just complicates the whole situation. But what makes it worse is that Jonah, through the restraining order notice, learns where Joanne lives. He knows that his father has a gun, so he decides he's going to go confront Joanne. And mind you, this boy can't be more than 14, 15, maybe 16 years old, so his frontal cortex is not fully developed yet. And that's probably why when he goes into her home and her dog starts yapping, he goes into one of the closets in Joanne's home and kind of hides there. And being that Joanne, when she finds him, thinks that maybe he's scared of his mom, he wants to confess what she's been doing to him or whatever, she treats him very nicely even though he broke into her home. And while she's doing that, he shoots her. And unfortunately for Laura, she tried to stop this, I should know. She did call her son when she realized the gun was gone, but to no avail. And when she shows up on the scene and sees him there, she decides, okay, I'm going to put my fingerprints on this gun. I'm going to do everything I can to make it so that they'll look at me and think I did it. And even during the trial, they try to get access to the audio or some more information about that call she made to Jonah. In order to stop them, she just takes a guilty plea so that this all ends and they can just move on, and she just takes the charge while her son gets to live his life, and also Eric gets to continue living his as the caretaker. Now, when it comes to highlights, I think one of the biggest notable things when it comes to these 3 episodes, talking about them as a whole, is definitely Whitney Cummings in terms of what she provides in her episode. Now, if you're familiar with Whitney Cummings' podcast and also her stand-up sets, you would know that when it comes to Brenda's story, potentially is not far-fetched from the stuff that she experienced when she was an up-and-coming comedian. But even with it potentially having some familiarity to it, there's no denying, in the case of Eddie Murphy, Jim Carrey, and a few others, you see a stand-up comedian who's able to translate all the trauma and issues they usually make into a joke and now tap into that to give a very good, valid, dramatic performance. Now, I'm not saying it's going to possibly lead to an Emmy nomination or anything like that, but I do think it is a type of performance which definitely allows you to see there's more to Whitney Cummings than talking about mental health in a joking kind of way and really tapping into what it means to be someone who potentially has PTSD, trauma, and wants to be an advocate not only through her stand-up, podcast, and all that, but also through acting, exhibit the kind of pains, the kind of issues, and everything that goes through processing what happened to you. Following that as a highlight is with the Indigenous People episode, or the one focused on the Navajo Nation, and that's just the beauty of having an indigenous story which hits multiple points. As pretty much anyone can tell you, when it comes to representation, we're still in this very weird spot where representation has mostly focused on queer people and also black people. In terms of Latinos, Asians, indigenous people, it's still very much lacking. And then if you want to go into other sets, like showing people who are heavy set, who are not just made to be in roles like we saw Brendan Fraser do in The Whale, or was playing comedic characters like Fat Amy, but still definitely don't have a lot of space, or rather there's not a lot of space made for a real type of diversity beyond something simple and still to a certain degree stereotypical. But that aside, sort of like I believe it came out in Sundance, this movie called Fancy Dance that we covered, you get an idea of life beyond activism when it comes to what the Navajo Nation and everybody in that episode are dealing with. You get to see people like Derek and hear about them going into basketball and getting scholarships. You see Derek and Shundeen talk about the relationship and kind of have a cute little reconciliation in a way. And even when it comes to things that may not be the greatest for them, like being so close to different type of environmental hazards that affect their health, or maybe the tribal leaders not being able to do or not wanting to do much, it feels like there was a proper mix of trying to get you to understand that yes, things on different reservations may not be great, but that doesn't mean they're always this terrible thing we're just facing adversity on. So getting back to the Brenda/Whitney Cummings episode, another highlight, though maybe not the hugest highlight, was also getting to see a comedian community. You get to see that in a handful of shows. There was one that I think was coming on when Jim Carrey had a show on Showtime. It was paired with it that I can't remember the name of offhand, but that's one example. But you don't really get to see a lot of examples of it. We do know that a lot of comedians have camaraderie. Like if you look at Adam Sandler's crew that usually get cast in any of his comedy movies, there's clearly a community and relationship that a lot of us are not made to be privy to. And I think even in Louie, when that show was on, we kind of got a bit of it, but I feel like with this episode, you really got to see, even if it was in a small way between Chad and Brenda, kind of the back and forth between different friends in terms of making comedy and finding, the laughter and darkness. And even in terms of Joyce as a mentor, that relationship between the person who keeps you working, keeps you in a position where you could possibly get seen, and a comedian who is in a very vulnerable position trying to figure out, how do I make all this stuff happen to me into something that people can laugh and connect with, while in some ways still very much struggling with it. And alongside that highlight, because for most of these highlights it's going to probably be about the Brenda episode, so another highlight which comes from the Brenda episode is just a showing of why the whole Me Too movement matters. Because as much as a lot of the point of focus is on the different men who take advantage of vulnerable women, you cannot discount the people who act in a way that allows the culture to continue and make it so that these men think they can get away with this. In the case of Brenda's episode, it's Joyce who, because Brenda's threatening her golden goose, she tries to get her to move on, just deal with it, if not act as a mediary so that, or as an intermediary. Either way, she tries to act as a middle person in order to keep this from getting to the press and becoming a bigger thing than what she wants it to be. And overall, I'm not going to dwell too much on Me Too because you already probably know what that is. I feel like this episode really pushes the idea that the issue of not only having to dismantle the systems but also get rid of the actors in the long run, even though as we've seen from Brenda's point of view, it can cause a lot of suffering, but At the same time, as I think the Zora Neale Hurston quote goes, if you are silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. And for her, that was not an option. Lastly, in terms of the highlights, and again, it's for the Brenda episode, a part of me appreciates the fact that with these episodes of Accused, sometimes we get an imperfect resolution. We're not always going to get the person who deserves to be guilty being guilty, or the person being innocent being found innocent. Sometimes we're going to get situations like we saw with Zeke where, yes, he did not get charged with rape, but he did get burnt quite badly to the point where now he's hiding his face and is now starting to experience the kind of shame that he did not have after he did what he did to Brenda. So it's an imperfect resolution to her story, but at the same time, it's better than the alternative, which can have been much worse. Which leads to the on-the-fence topics, which unfortunately only deal with the episodes that talk about what the Navajo Nation protesters were going through, and also what Laura's going through. Now, starting with the Laura episode, I feel like they was playing it safe with this one. It's like almost that who wrote this episode, it almost feels like when it came to Daniel Pearl and the other people involved, they wanted to touch upon how InfoWars and organizations like that speak and how they recruit people, while also touching upon how people who are dealing with their fake news handle it, yet they didn't want to go too deep and go too far to either side. They didn't want to completely outright damn Joanne, yet at the same time they didn't want to outright make it seem that they were on the sides of the victims. And with that whole tightrope act, it's like, I get it, because you want to kind of have the episode not seem as biased as it kind of lends itself to be, but it also makes it feel like you're not going far enough. And then when we're switching over to the Navajo Nation story, I think one of the issues that we had was that when it comes to Laura's story, when it comes to Brenda's story, you can tell it's very character driven. It really puts whoever the actor is, who's the episode's named after, front and center, and really make it about them and drive the episode home. For the Navajo Nation storyline, when it comes to Natani, I don't feel like he's a central character. I'm more focused on what Derek's going from, more focused on Chase or his sister. Him, it's not until the FBI agent is trying to make a deal with him to make him into a former does he feel like he's a central or main character. Up until then, he's part of an ensemble. And I would even say, to a certain degree, it feels like since, if I was to compare this to the episode with Ava, who was the deaf woman who was fearful that the baby she was a surrogate to would have been harmed, I want to put a comparison in that, because I feel like with her storyline, yes, she's representing a community that doesn't get a lot of representation in terms of media, yet at the same time, she was still able to command and really be able to be seen as a star. With Natani's story, I would say that he got swallowed by everything that it means to be part of the Navajo Nation. He didn't get to stand out. Overall, when it comes to Accused, it still does this wonderful way of presenting these stories that may get touched upon a little bit like on a CSI or a Law and Order episode, but it's allowing us to see the point of view not of the people who's trying to solve the crime, but the people who are involved in, at least in the mind of the prosecutor, committing the crime. And with getting their side of the story, even though 9 times out of 10 we're pushed to root for them, at the same time, it really also shows you how the justice system isn't made to necessarily uphold heroes and put down villains. It's mainly focused on public perception, and if you're not able to achieve the public's perception of being the good person in this, as we saw with Brenda, you don't get justice. As we saw with the Navajo Nation episode in terms of Derek's friends, yes, you may have been poisoned for a generation, but it's not until you do something drastic does anybody really take note of what's going on. Or, in the case of Laura's episode, yes, something terrible happened, yet because of free speech, which does also include consequences, unfortunately, you may end up being the one paying the most consequences, as there's no real legislation on free speech also meaning you telling the truth. It means you getting to say whatever you want, and yes, there's a consequence of, being held liable for certain things you say, but until you get to that court process in which you are able to prove somebody really did something that's just defamation, you got nothing. And just this show really being able to each episode focus on a different matter, and even if it can't really get the characters home in terms of really driving their story, at least at the end of the day be able to talk about these different situations and scenarios, what is the Me Too movement, the fake news movement, etc. At the very least, Accused knows how to make it so if you may not remember the characters, at the very least you remember the story and what they went through.